Thank you, Eddie, for telling us all about the logistics and things to think about, as well as AV. After you have decided on which tools to use and set the dates for your virtual meeting, the next pre-meeting and last meeting lifecycle 1 item to work on is setting the agenda. This is the case for remote as well as in-person meetings. And failure to plan is planning to fail. I love this quote because it sums up the importance for creating an agenda for your meetings. So it's interactive time again. I'm going to ask a series of 2 questions, and if it applies to you, in this case, raise your hand in the Zoom like you see featured in this example. Mike is monitoring and will report back after each question as to how many raised their hands. Any questions before we begin? All right, so the question I have for you is for your meetings, like for your advisory committee meetings, which majority of you indicated that's what you do you routinely get through only a few of your total number of agenda items? If this is the case for you, go ahead and raise your Zoom hand, like you see pictured here. Looks like some people have raised their hand.
So far we have two hands raised.
Well, I'm glad it's only 2.
It's a good sign.
Yeah. All right, go ahead and move on to the next one. I guess you can unraise your hand. All right, so then the next question I have for you is this a problem that you have? Does everyone forget what their action item assignments are for the next meeting? And don't forget to raise your Zoom hand if this is a problem that you've encountered for your meetings, that people don't get their action items done.
So far we have 4 or 5.
Sounds like this is a bigger issue.
Yes, we've almost tripled the previous problem.
All right. So if you raise your hand, which you can now take your hands down if they're still raised, if you raised your hand to any of these questions, it might be time to rethink your meeting strategies. And that's what we're hoping to help you with. While meetings in person and remote are meant to be an engine of productivity in the workplace, that's not the reality. The reality is that most meetings are low quality, and of course, as NEDARC, we want to show you that data because we're really nerdy. So most execs consider more than 67% of meetings to be failures. And you may be wondering, what's the significance of that finding? Well, low quality meetings are actually harmful to your work environment. And they're harmful because they're a waste of time. And I don't have to ask any of you guys, how many of you have extra time you can spare in the workday? If you think about it in this context, there are over 25 million meetings per day in the US. It's estimated that 15% of an organization's collective time is spent in meetings. If the majority are of low quality, that's an inordinate amount of wasted time in the workplace. And it's estimated that more than $37 billion per year is spent on low quality meetings. So how do we fix this problem? Through planning and creating structure. That's the answer. An agenda is your answer of how you can plan and create structure for your meeting. I know it's kind of boring, but it's the answer. I can't emphasize this enough. Planning your agenda is one of the most important tasks you need to complete to help ensure a high quality meeting. Before even starting an agenda though, you will want to determine if a meeting is actually needed. It sounded like some people said that earlier of worthless meetings. Well, maybe people are just having a meeting to have a meeting. So as part of deciding if a meeting is needed, you should define the objective and desired outcome that you want to have for that meeting. And don't keep that objective to yourself. Add it to your agenda. Here is one of the resources we have created for you, and it's available for download. Mike will put the link in the chat area for this resource. It's a meeting agenda template that is customizable and set up following the best practices we have and will discuss in this presentation. As you can see, the template has a place for you to put in your objective and/or goal. It might be hard for you to define your meeting objectives. So to help you define them, here are some examples. So you can think about it in this way. The objective of this meeting is to make a decision on, generate ideas about, get status on, or make plans for. Based on your extensive experience hosting meetings, I have 2 questions for you guys again. Remember, you can unmute to answer or add your answers to the chat box. So the first question I have is, which, if any, of these examples have you used in the past?
Andre, there's a comment from Anna about the previous resource that was just shown as a great way to record advisory committee meetings for future or for federal reporting purposes.
You mean the objective and goal? I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, what you have posted right now, what you have up on the screen is a great way to record attendees and sort of minutes, but categorized into objectives and action items. And those are 2 things that are typically asked for in federal reporting when we report back on what our quarterly meetings or our most recent quarterly meeting with advisory committees has to look like.
Thanks, Anna.
And Robin in Montana said she's used all of them.
Oh, great, Robin. So Robin's used all 4 of these to help her identify objectives. All right, so I have a second question for you. Which do you plan on using in the future? So you see these ideas here. Which, if any, do you think you could use in the future for your meetings?
This is Anna. I'll continue using similar quotes to what you have here.
Robin again reiterates that she'll use all of them.
You can think about it some more. This can really help you. It's like we had said earlier, is engagement isn't just one thing. It's multiple things you have to do to build together. And this really helps with engagement for people. So the number 1 rule to having a high quality meeting, whether it's in person or remote, is to set an agenda and to get feedback from the participants in advance of the meeting. So what that is you send it out saying, here's my draft. What do you think? What do you want to add? Asking about timings and all that. So getting that feedback from participants includes letting them add all those items. And this really increases engagement because now they have buy-in.
And Andrea, Eddie just posed the question, do you want to have 1 objective for a meeting?
Thank you, Eddie, for asking that. It depends on the meeting. So if you have a meeting that you want to be really focused, then you want just likely 1 objective. However, let's say you're having a staff meeting and there's multiple different unrelated topics you want to talk about, you likely have a different objective for each one of those. So it just depends on your needs. Setting your agenda accomplishes 4 aims. And they're listed here. Is the first one is it notifies participants of the meeting expectations through the listed objectives, outcomes, action items, and agenda topics. So, if they know what to expect, it helps them be prepared, which is the number 2. And that helps then also with engagement. It also helps table those side off-topic discussions. And number 2 and number 3 were also mentioned by you guys when you registered as problems. So by doing that agenda ahead of time and getting feedback, it'll help you with that. And then number 4 is setting your agenda also generates buy-in from participants or stakeholders through their feedback. So here's an example of how we prep for one of our internal NEDARC staff meetings. Is I send out the agenda to all participants the week before the meeting. And this builds staff buy-in as well as notifies them of expectations and helps them be prepared. I attach a draft copy of the agenda for them to review, which also helps them be prepared, especially for any outstanding action items that they're assigned. For example, earlier several of you indicated that participants forgot to do their action items. And by sending the agenda early with those outstanding action items, it's a reminder to get them done. And since our staff meetings multiple times in a month, they have a short turnaround time when those have to be done. I know it's going to be different for you. Most of you are doing advisory committee meetings and you don't have those multiple times a month. So I also give them, meaning our staff, a deadline of getting any feedback to me by noon, the day before the meeting, so I can adjust the agenda. And sometimes I have to negotiate the changes if I have a bunch of requests for more time than we have available for the entire meeting. So like if I get a whole bunch of different ideas and people are saying, I want to talk about this and I want this much time, and I add that all up and that's longer than what we have set for the meeting, I have to negotiate with them. And once again, since they have input, it increases their buy-in as well as helps table side off-topic discussions because they know this is what we're going to talk about. We often have assignments for the staff to complete before the meeting to ensure they are prepared, and we can spend the time, therefore, on productive discussions or activities instead of getting everyone up to speed. This is about increasing that engagement again, because if you're having to spend all your time getting people up to speed, that's not about being engaging and getting things done. So it's good to give them assignments. And then if staff haven't done an assignment, we do not update them as they understand the expectations based on norms we developed as a group. And Braden will discuss norms tomorrow. Sounds like a lot of work and planning, right? Well, it is. Remember in the opening talk, I mentioned that 1 hour of meeting content equaled about 2 hours of planning. Our staff meetings are 2 times per month, for 2 hours of scheduled time for each of those meetings. So on average, for that 4 hours of monthly meetings, I spend 8 to 12 hours of planning and on follow-up. Well, that sounds like a lot of time and is needed and has improved our productivity within NEDARC and staff engagement during our staff meetings. So all high-quality meetings have 3 components, touched on these a little bit prior, and those components are topics, outcomes, and processes, and use these components to set your agenda. So the topic is what you want to discuss or focus on. The outcome is the way you want the topic to turn out, and the process is the facilitation method you will use to get to your topic outcome. So here's an example of these 3, and this is just an example we made up. So think about it as the topic in this case. Somebody had budget carryover, so they wanted to discuss that. What was the outcome they wanted for that discussion about budget carryover is they wanted to find out how they should spend the money for that. And then they thought about, well, what process can we use then to be able to get to our outcome? And in this example, they decided to use a brainstorming and then a vote. So building on these 3 components, agendas should also list outstanding action items from previous meetings, which you should cover during the first part of your meeting. So that should be kind of like your soft open for your meeting. And your agenda should also contain a time estimate and presenter for each topic and the process for arriving at desired topic outcomes. Remember how several of you indicated earlier that often participants don't complete their action items? Well, here is a pro tip for dealing with repeat offenders. You can star those action items that don't get done by the deadline and have them starred on the next agenda and keep adding stars each time the action item isn't done. So it kind of, in a nice, safe way, convinces them they need to get in gear and get it done. And you're holding them accountable in a non-confrontational way. When you're making your agenda, don't just leave it at the main topic as a bullet. Put in those sub-bullets. And to help participants and presenters be prepared, which increases engagement, list the sub-bullets under the main topic. Don't forget to list a presenter for each sub-item and the amount of time. If you have the same presenter for all, that doesn't matter as much, but the amount of time does. And here's an example from a recent internal NEDARC staff meeting. As you can see, we have multiple sub-items under the main agenda, workshop topic. Then to further help the facilitator, timekeeper, and presenters, we have a time allotments for each of these to add up to the total duration for the main agenda topic. So here's a hint. This is where you can facilitate discussions by having targeted questions for participants. In this example, we sent the registrant report to staff to review with specific questions in mind. And as you can also see, we really do something with the answers you provide. We're not just asking those for the fun of it. Now I'll show you examples of action items and time and presenter using the agenda template resource we created. You will note in this example that the action items are the first items to address during the meeting. So they're at the very top right under the objective and goal, and they list the person responsible and the due date. It's important to make sure that the reporting for the action items, the person doesn't go into detail and just says complete, incomplete, or in progress, because this should be a quick part of the agenda. And we constantly have to be reminded internally. So as a facilitator, when people start getting into all this detail about where they are, I have to step in as a facilitator and remind them, remember, we just need to know complete, incomplete, or in progress. And then if an item is incomplete, a new deadline will need to be established and the action item followed up on during the next meeting. And here's an example of time and presenter. As you can see here, each agenda topic will have a separate row. There is a column then for presenter or facilitator if you were doing something like a brainstorming, and then the duration or the amount of time is the last column. And speaking of duration, estimating time for agenda topics can be tricky. I noticed several of you raised your Zoom hands when I asked if you often don't get through agenda topics and items. And it might be because you haven't allotted the appropriate amount of time based on the meeting type. So the type of meeting you want to have will dictate the amount of time needed to accomplish your objectives and outcomes. And to help you estimate time for your meetings, we've developed a table of the most common meeting types with the ideal meeting length. And this was actually based on research, not just us arbitrarily coming up with something. So these are the most common meeting types with the ideal meeting length based on these best practices and the research. This meeting length is based on a meeting of up to 10 participants. And if you have more people attending your meeting, the length will also increase. So if you have 20 people, you probably have to double these numbers for the length. And I'll review a strategic planning type, since nearly a quarter of you indicated that you usually do this type of meeting, and it's one of the most requested types we get when we do site visits. So as you can see here, it says for meeting type strategic planning, and then ideal meeting length is, and this is for up to 10 participants, is you'll need 8 hours for initial meeting and then several subsequent 1-hour follow-up meetings. So that's a lot of time. And maybe the problem you're having is you're not scheduling enough time. So on the next slide, let's go through an example of how to estimate time for a meeting that combines multiple different types. In this one, I just arbitrarily chose decision-making and one topic brainstorming session. So let's say I wanted to do that. I wanted to be that we'd make a decision and then have some brainstorming. So what I would do is add several hours for the decision making, and then one topic brainstorming is 1 hour. So for a meeting to be able to accomplish that, you're looking at 8 to 9 hours for your meeting. And this is probably won't lean some of you over, and it's probably why you're not being able to get through things. It takes time to do these things. Another pro tip for you guys, there are ways you can trim your agendas to get through everything too. So if you have items that essentially are a quick update that don't require feedback, don't include them in your agenda, and instead include them in a regular email or newsletter update. NEDARC staff will laugh, but there are things that we have that we don't need to discuss, but we will talk about it anyway. If it's on the agenda, even if it's just an update. So for example, we have moved to this, and we use this as an example of an internal email template that we use where we can just add those updates in there, and it really has saved time on our agendas. Along with setting an agenda, make sure to designate a facilitator, which is often the person drafting the agenda. And based on what you guys answered for this workshop registration, most of you serve as the facilitator. So you can think of the facilitator or yourselves as a traffic cop for your meeting. And a facilitator will keep the meeting on topic and running when discussions digress, which you also probably have heard referred to as having parking lots. Facilitators will also ensure that your meeting starts on time, to engage participants, and to assign roles. Farah Jaffer sums it all up with this quote: "Smart facilitators are key to successful meetings. They keep people on track, are not afraid to interrupt, call out participants for being off topic, and summarize the to-dos and next steps." Since most of you indicate that you're the facilitator, these are some of your responsibilities, and they can be uncomfortable, and we understand that. Facilitation is hard, so we have this pro tip for you that you can use for your meetings. When participants get off topic, you can say something like what you see here. Because we have little time on the agenda and a few topics we must absolutely cover, let's please take this conversation offline. So here's just a little quick thing that you can use and keep in your back pocket for when that happens during your meetings. Before we end the session, there are two more important meeting rules I want to cover with you. In addition to a facilitator, you should also consider assigning a timekeeper and a note taker before the meeting. It's not reasonable for you to fill all of these roles, which likely you all are. This is a way you can increase engagement by assigning these tasks to other participants or stakeholders. Also have the assignments for each role rotate through your participants. For example, Jane, Eddie, and Braden trade off who will be responsible for the staff meeting notes. One meeting, it will be, for example, Jane, the next meeting, Eddie, and then the third meeting, Braden, and they'll trade off like that. And by the way, also by having participants take the notes, it actually causes them to stay more engaged as well. The timekeeper and facilitator work in tandem in two specific ways. The timekeeper helps the facilitator keep the meeting running and on schedule. Remember the duration column in the agenda template? Well, the facilitator and timekeeper also work together to help hold participants accountable for the time limits based on the durations listed in the agenda, and don't let them stray off topic, which probably is another problem you're dealing with. The note taker is not taking meeting notes. For note taking, the important parts of the meeting to capture are the action items and decisions. Each action item should have a deadline and which participants are responsible for its completion. And we can't forget to hold people accountable and manage their expectations, right? I know several of you will likely say that for your meetings, there's certain rules you have to follow and you have to take the minutes. If that's the case, my suggestion is you have that person who keeps the minutes, but also have someone who is in charge of note taking and just concentrate on the action items and decisions. Agenda template also has areas for action items and decisions like we just discussed. And this template has areas for recording the status of your action item from the previous meetings that are being reported on, as well as areas for new action items and decisions associated with specific agenda topics. The action items also have places for the responsible parties and the deadlines for each of them. We've covered many concepts related to setting an agenda and remote meeting guidelines, and they are, number one, planning your agenda is the most important task to do for a successful and high quality meeting, and this will lead to high engagement. And number one rule along with that of setting your agenda is getting feedback from the participants on the agenda before the meeting begins. Your agenda should have three important components. One is a topic and outcomes and processes. Agendas should also include outstanding action items and contain time estimate and presenters. The facilitator, which is you guys in the most cases, are important to make sure that you designate someone if you're not able to. And then other roles that you'll want to designate that will also help you in managing a meeting is having a timekeeper as well as a note taker. So here's some more resources. They're similar to Eddie's session. Once again, lots of references we use to be able to create the content for this session. And I just wanted to ask you, what questions do you have related to agendas before we close out the day?
It's like Debbie asked if the resources are available for all of us. And Mike put in the links as well. So
yes, they are. By all of us, I'm assuming you mean all of the people who are attending. And yes, it is. They're on our website. That's what those links link to. And as we said, each of these sessions will be recorded. And once we get these recordings all fixed, we'll get them uploaded to YouTube, and we will send out to all of the EMSC program managers because not everyone was able to attend.
Andrea, this is Jane. Do you recommend that one facilitator be responsible for the agenda, for a specific meeting, that one person hosts that? I know that in some of our meetings, we trade off back and forth with doing the agenda.
In most cases, as I understand, for most EMSC programs, they're a staff of one, so they don't have options. But if you can get someone to help you, that is great. Yes, you can trade off that way. And, you probably have a chair of your advisory committee, maybe your supervisor, so you can work with them. What we also often do is when we have to facilitate a meeting is we will have a co-facilitator, meaning that's what we do on NEDARC, who will help us, and maybe we trade off. Some of you have had site visits where maybe 2 NEDARC people have come, or a NEDARC and EIC, and we trade off facilitating like a brainstorming or something like that. So if you have the resource, yes, use it. But if you, unfortunately, I'm assuming most of you don't have that. Are we okay if we move on? I have some last questions we have for you guys. All right, so we have a wrap up for day 1. We wanted to check in with you. While we know we haven't completed this workshop, I thought it might be useful to review the learning objectives and to check in with the status for each. So the first learning objective was that participants would discover the life cycles of a meeting. So I wanted to ask you guys, what are the life cycles of a meeting?
Anna says before, during, and after.
Right. The second objective is identifying opportunities for improving future meetings. So this is more so we would like to hear from you is what opportunities did you learn today that you plan on employing to improve your meetings?
Rachel Ford says she likes the idea of having someone keep track of action items. As James says, agendas are your friend. Sam in Michigan says she's checking out the resources. They look very helpful. Greg in North Carolina is definitely using the break countdown slides. Debbie Kuhn mentions it's nice to take turns taking notes.
I haven't asked the staff, Debbie, but I assume they groan when they realize it's their turn to take the notes, but at least they share the burden.
Oh, I was just going to say, Andrea, to answer your question, I actually like taking the notes because it keeps me engaged and it helps me to retain what action items are mine.
Thanks, Jane. Chelsea in Minnesota asks, when is the best time to send out an agenda, firstly, and then secondly, how frequently should you send out the agenda before an advisory committee meeting?
Well, it depends on your group. If you're struggling with them, so let's say they're generally engaged, then you don't have to send it as much. But if you're finding that overall they're not engaged, then you probably want to send it multiple times. So you just have to think about, I'm assuming you guys do quarterly, and depending on how big of a thing you're working on, meaning like if you're doing strategic planning, you probably want to send it out more than a week ahead of time. But generally I found that we're all so busy that a week beforehand is probably the best bet. You'll have to, try it out and see if that's working for people. And then you can also get feedback from them saying how useful was it. I mean, a week ahead of time, essentially finding out if they would like it earlier. You can find those things out and then cater it to what your group would like. But the thing is, there are some really big action items that people need a lot of time, you need to weigh that, but most of them is a week.
Julia mentions that they send out calendar invites 1 month in advance, and then the agenda goes out 2 weeks in advance. Rachel says she sends out the agenda 3 to 4 weeks prior, and then adds the attachments 1 to 2 weeks prior. And Anna just said that she gives a general idea of topics when she schedules, and then keeps the agenda kind of evolving in the Outlook event. Carolina says she sends it a week before.
All right, so we have one final objective that I wanted to check in with you guys. And the final objective was ways to increase engagement, because that was really big, what you guys want to learn about. So based on what was presented today, what are ways, methods, tools, whatever you plan to use to improve participant engagement?
Anna loves the failing to plan is planning to fail quote. Anna says she needs to think more about the action items and how to use that to keep people engaged. We might hopefully discuss a little bit of that tomorrow as we talk about the after meeting steps. Debbie Kuhn says, I send assignments and no one does them.
Jim's going to talk more about etiquette and setting group norms. One of the things that you can decide as a group of what happens if someone doesn't do an assignment like that, the group, and then it's the group deciding the repercussions for those who don't. And that might help, especially since they're part of deciding what happens, that might help increase their engagement of getting stuff done.
Hey, Andrea, I know you're surprised it's Anna again. I've had advisory committee members that don't participate and are clearly doing other things during meetings. And I've just, being me, reached out directly to them via phone and said, hey, I noticed you were distracted. You know, do you still feel like you have the bandwidth to be on the advisory committee? If you don't, that's fine. Just let me know so I can, you know, get somebody who's going to help us work to improve pediatric care. And I've lost a member over it, but it's also that person's been replaced with someone who's more productive. So it ended up being better in the long run to just sort of chat directly with them and, you know, give them the option to back down, you know, suggesting that maybe they don't have the bandwidth.
That is an excellent approach. And I think people can use that one.
I just want to mention real quick, we are 5 minutes over. So
Okay.
if people need to head, that's fine, you know.
None of it's easy. If facilitation was easy, we could all do it, right? And it's uncomfortable. It's the finding the way to say it that's non-confrontational and doesn't upset people.